Hey, there we are. I'm Pastor Gillespie from St. John Evangelical Lutheran Church and School, Sherman Center in Random Lake, Wisconsin. I'm actually in Sherman Center. The church is out the window this way. You can see my study here, and I know we did a little bit of experimentation this morning. Hopefully we got everything all set up here for tonight's class. We are in 1 Corinthians. We've been studying this through the COVID-19 lockdown, and of course now we're not quite as locked down, but we're still doing our online Bible study. I think it's a benefit not only for our own members. About half our congregation still remains at home and for various reasons unable to worship with us or attend Bible study. So we're going to keep doing it this way for now, although gathering in person has its advantages, especially when it comes to the questions and answers. As I mentioned this morning on our daily prayer, the internet connection here at church is a little, how shall we say it, substandard. I know all of our neighbors have the same problem, but to do something like this does typically require a connection a little bit better. But hopefully all the settings that I've changed will make it both listenable and watchable. It is possible at times that the screen will become very pixelated as the connection quality drops off significantly. But hopefully then it'll pick back up as connection is available. We're on a shared wireless connection with all of our neighbors. And being in the evening, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people at home all using their connection. All right. So let's see if I can put it up on screen here. Yeah, there we go. So it's been a little bit since we had our class. I was on vacation last week, and we are, as I said, in 1 Corinthians. We're going to look at chapter 11, but we probably need to back up a little bit just to get some context, and I think that will help prepare us then to study today's text as well. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Eileen and Gus. I see you down there, and there's Grace, my mother. Okay. So a few of you have joined us. Some will probably join us later. And then, of course, you can watch it on replay tomorrow or later this evening. So to back up a little bit, we've got to look at kind of the conclusion of the argument Paul had been going on about really for about 3 chapters. And we're talking about food sacrificed to idols, and then whether or not a Christian can participate in the eating of that food. So this is the conclusion of his argument here. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question, and here's the key phrase, for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for, there it is again, conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? All right, so conscience here is not dealing so much with your conscience, because as Paul says, as a Christian, you have been set free. You are free to eat this meat that even had been sacrificed to idols. The problem is your neighbor's conscience, right? So what offense or scandal might you cause your neighbor by eating food that had been sacrificed to idols? What might you be saying? Well, that you believe in those idols, for example. We talked 2 weeks ago about participation in, I think we talked about probably same-sex marriage, I think is one of the things we talked about, and how by participating, you are celebrating it. You're actually condoning it. And I know that's probably an uncomfortable opinion. It is my pastoral opinion. I think it's wise not to support, even by attendance, lest you give the wrong impression. Because actually the conscience of those marrying, according to our state's allowance, but not according to the scripture's allowance, need to have their conscience affected, and especially so by a parent or by a family member or by a close friend. All right. So again, conscience needs to be informed, and it is informed by God's word, but it's also informed by your actions, right? And your neighbor's conscience, I should say. All right. So it's not a judgment against you, but it's actually a judgment that you make for the sake of your neighbor. So notice how Paul then concludes in verse 31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense, either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. All right, so now that's the real nut. Yeah, I know it's pixelating. I can see the numbers down here. Audio is going to be good. This setting, at least the audio stays consistent, even if the video quality drops. And yeah, if somebody wants to join me in my effort to improve the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, that is to get lines run to this building, I'd welcome it. Okay, it's a big project. I have a list of people to contact in hopes of putting enough dollars together to make it happen. But anyway, all right, because we're talking like $150,000. It's not inexpensive. Okay, so back to the text here. That they may be saved. That essential nut is, I think, what you want to what you want to latch on to, right? So we want to affect our neighbor's conscience for the sake of their salvation, not to put up a stumbling block or a barrier to them receiving salvation in Christ, right? Now, Christ's cross alone, as Paul said back in chapter 1, Christ himself crucified is a stumbling block and a rock of offense. There's enough offense already just in the gospel that we don't need to set up other barriers. Yeah, look at that. Oh, it dropped way down. Let's see if it comes back. Well, just keep listening whether you can see or not. All right. Let's see. Yeah, give no offense. And then there were 3 groups that he talked about. One, either to the Jews, so those are those who would be scandalized by you eating meat sacrificed to idols, especially unclean meat. To the Greeks, right, so, or the Gentiles, and that is those who might think that you support or condone idolatry, all right, or to the church of God. That's to your fellow brothers and sisters in the church. As we talked about, I think back in, chapter 3 or chapter 2, referring to those within the body of Christ who are not yet, fully mature, right? And so are not yet prepared for you to kind of, for lack of a better term, flaunt your freedom in front of them. The freedom that they have too, and yet they aren't yet have grown into that freedom. All right. And so then it ends with imitate me just as I also imitate Christ, right? So we have this imitation, this, this handing over, really. It's a handing over. Christ sets the example of not seeking his own profit, but the profit of, salvation of others. Now, Paul has exemplified that in his own life of service to the church. And then he's encouraging the church of Corinth then to continue in that as well. All right. Now we get to some fun topics. All right. So we'll see how far we get tonight. We'll probably get a little bit into the practice of the Lord's Supper in the church of Corinth. But we'll deal first with this hot topic. So we have 2 hot topics. One, it's uncomfortable, and it's going to take us a couple weeks probably. One is the role of women in the church. And then the second is the practices surrounding the Lord's Supper, which are controversial as well, largely for the same reasons or similar reasons, actually. All right, so we best read the text, and I'll be sure to read it nice and clearly and slowly, since you may or may not be able to see it. Obviously, you can follow along if you've got a Bible at home. 1 Corinthians 11. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shorn or shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created from woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things are from God. All right, so that's pretty complicated. I'll try not to scroll too fast. As I expect, it probably gets pretty pixelated there. I was doing so much better earlier today. Like I said, having a class here in the evening might be too challenging. But my home setup is being dismantled, so I need to do it here. Okay. Okay. So now, Paul reminds the brothers, and this is an encouraging statement, to remember all the things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. This word here, delivered, is to be handed over. It's paradidomi. So it's as they handed them over, meaning Paul had those traditions, he gave them to them, and now they keep them and they will hand them forward. All right. So this is a fourth commandment issue, really. We're talking about a tradition that teaches a truth. Now, is the tradition itself essential? Or is it universal? Meaning, this practice of head covering that was certainly the case here in Corinth and maybe common in the Mediterranean world of the first century. Is that something that we have to do today, or rather, is it the truth that is being taught? That's the main point that Paul is making, right? But we also, I think, want to be careful about throwing off traditions. How should you say it? Willy-nilly, right? Without consideration of what they teach and how they are helpful to communicate to one another, or especially to communicate to children. All right. I'm hoping my internet connection improves. I'm watching it go. Well, one way or another, I'm recording it as well. Let's see. So keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. And so one of those traditions is this practice of head covering. And we don't know exactly. I think probably the closest thing today you might see is in the Eastern world, especially among Muslims, among those who practice Islam, is that the woman's head is covered. And it's actually not just a sign of subjection, but it's actually a sign of honor. Maybe something similar for a woman in our context is a wedding ring, a wedding band, right? So like if a woman, is out with friends and there's a single man, if he sees a woman with a wedding band, he's not going to approach her if he's at all decent, right? Because she has already been claimed by another, right? So he honors her marriage by respecting that sign of her marriage. All right, so we have something similar to that here, where women are honored by covering their heads, right? Whereas men do not; their heads are left open. Now, this word for head is kephale, and there's a lot of ways to understand this in Greek, but I think probably the best way to understand this is the source, right? Like as in, what would be the equivalent that we have? Like headwaters, right? So the headwaters are the source of, say, a river, right? So we're talking about the source. I want you to know that the source of every man, that is everyone, is Christ. And the source of woman is man, right? Now he's talking about in terms of creation. That's going to come up here in a few verses, right? So at the beginning, God made Adam, and then he took Eve from Adam. He took the rib and then formed Eve and gave her to him, okay? And then the head of Christ is God, and by God, Paul means God the Father, right? So the Son proceeds from the Father. Man proceeds from the Son, right? Because we are made in the image of God, that is, in the image of the Son, Jesus. And then woman comes from man, right? Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head, his source, that is Christ. Okay, does that make sense? So every man praying or prophesying, and yet acting as if he is a woman, right? This is what's important here. Dishonors his head, his source, that is Christ, right? Because Christ has elected him, has chosen him to be the preacher, the prayer, the prophesier, okay? Especially of the household, not just of the church where we have male pastors, but even in the household, the head of the household, in a marriage that is still together, hasn't been ripped asunder by divorce, the husband is the preacher for that household. Every woman who prays or prophesies, which she does too, she teaches the faith to her children, with her head uncovered, that is, as a man, dishonors her head, that is, her husband or the man. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. All right, so now Paul's being very pejorative here. He's pushing it. He does the same thing in Galatians 5, I believe, where the circumcision party is saying, well, you need to still be circumcised to be a Christian. And he says, well, you might as well just cut the whole thing off. Oh man, that's a text we don't read in church, but it's too bad because, what a mental image. You might as well just castrate yourself, is what he's basically saying. Because it has no point. But here, if the woman acts as if the man, she might as well go all the way and shave her head completely. Now, in the ancient world, this would have been unheard of, at least among Christians, and then especially among the Jews. Maybe not so much among the Romans, especially in these temple cults, where these women may have, in a sense, emasculated themselves by cutting their hair. But think about, like Solomon says, my memory's not so good, but talking about the hair of the woman being her beauty. Okay. Yeah. So actually, a text that might be interesting here is Deuteronomy 21. We'll go there. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and desire her, and would take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go in to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall set her free. All right. So there's this act of humility. It's almost like a new start where she is made unattractive until she has grieved her father and her mother. And then her beauty is restored to her as her hair grows again. Just kind of an interesting text, isn't it? All right. Yeah. If it is shameful, of course it is shameful. This is a rhetorical point that Paul is making. That if a woman, the priest does this in the temple as well in Numbers. But anyway, if it's shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered, right? If it is, I think probably that's a rhetorical question again. All right, so this is regards to the woman. Now, and again, we probably need to think a little bit about Paul's other teachings. I think 1 Timothy, but probably most notable is Ephesians 5, to recognize it's actually a place where he uses this terminology of a head again, regards to man and woman. So here it is. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. So there's that word head again. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let wives be to their own husbands in everything. So you see, that's very much the same idea. The husband serves Christ, the wife serves her husband, right? And it really works the other direction, which you'll see as you keep reading. Christ serves the man, and the man serves his wife. We have a problem with this idea of headship and of authority, and actually of a word that Paul uses here. Yeah, right there in verse 22, submission, upatasso. But it means to be placed under, but it's not under in a sense of quality or an importance, but in terms of service, that to be placed under somebody is to be served by them, not to be lorded over, okay? So that's important when it comes to marriage, that the husband is there to serve his wife, just as Christ is here to serve us. Okay. And might as well keep reading because this will be helpful. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church. You see how that works? And gave himself for her, that he might sanctify her and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish, not by her own doing, but by his doing, you see, by his washing and by water and the word. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body. Notice we, not singular, but plural, which we'll talk about, hopefully, if not today, next week. Members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. All right? Hopefully that helps to understand what's going on here, right? Why is the woman behaving as if she were the man? That's really what Paul's getting after here. That brings dishonor upon her. To stay in your place and actually to receive the tradition that's been handed over because it teaches this truth. Now, we haven't gotten to the point where Paul demonstrates this being true. Right now, he's just asserting that it is. All right. So let's talk about the man, beginning in verse 7. Let me scroll to it. All right. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. That's an interesting expression we'll talk about. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so also man comes through woman, but all things are from God. Okay, and let's work our way backwards, actually. What's really helpful here then is in verse 11 and 12, in case you get confused, Paul asserts that before God, there is no distinction between male or female. You know the expression. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but all are free or equal before God. All right. So salvation, and in terms of salvation, there is no distinction. In terms of baptism, there is one baptism, one Lord, right? One faith. So that's not what we're talking about here. And certainly in the resurrection on the last day, all will stand before God with no distinction, saved freely by the grace of God. All right. Not distinction in terms of how they were made, but distinction in terms of ordering. Okay. Although I guess there is some conversation in the scriptures about, the 4 living creatures and then the elders and the 12 and the 12. That's Revelation. So there does seem to be some order in heaven, but it's not ordered according to the household and according to male and female. All right. It doesn't seem anyway. So what Paul is talking about is not in terms of eternal salvation, and it's not in terms of God's love then, or his charity or his grace towards mankind. What it is regards to is the way that God has set up this creation. Now, a common objection to this whole text, especially by, I guess, what we call feminists, but especially those among the evangelicals who deny that the scriptures prohibit the ordination of women. All right. And actually some Lutherans too, I suppose. The problem is that their argument is that the ordering of creation with the husband over the wife, that is a result of the fall into sin. Right. And so you think about the way that the curse was pronounced against Adam and Eve, right? He shall rule over you, and you shall rule over him, or however the language goes from Genesis 3. Well, I suppose we should just look at it, because I can't remember. Why not? We can go there. All right, here's to Eve. Nope, Eve comes first. There's Adam. Here it is. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So your desire shall be to be the husband. That's what he's getting after, toward your husband, right? You'll envy his authority, his office, and he will abuse his office by ruling over you. So clearly, this relationship of male and female is affected by the fall. But Paul's argument is that the original ordering of things, which God restores in the church through the forgiveness of sins, actually goes before the fall into sin. It's actually the way that Adam and Eve were made, and actually, man and woman are made. Yeah, sorry about the video quality. It was better this morning, but it's worse tonight. So it goes. Like I say, a lot of people are on the internet here. Hopefully the text, because it's not moving, should be pretty clear. Okay. What were we talking about? Yes. So again, verse 7, man is in the image and glory of God. So Adam was made in God's image. You've heard that. That means Adam is a mirror of Christ, who is the image and reflection of God. Okay. So sometimes Christ is actually called by the New Testament the new Adam, or the new man, right? And because he looks like Adam, because Adam was made to look like him. See how that works? And then woman finds her glory in that lovely ordering of things, of the order of creation, as it's sometimes called, from creation. And this bothers a lot of women, even amongst Lutherans, amongst even people I know, because they say, well, my value as a woman isn't dependent upon a man, which in one sense is true, right? Like he said in verses 11 and 12, no, all things are from God. Your value is established by your baptism, right? But the way that you were made is you were made to work within this wonderful order, as we say in our prayers, and that it's actually for your benefit and for your protection. So a woman who doesn't have the protection of a man, today our society offers some protection, which is very helpful. In the ancient world, that wasn't true at all. All right. So it's actually a good thing. And maybe I haven't made a strong enough case, and it's probably a bigger subject than we really want to dig into tonight. Right? But again, he's arguing this point from creation. So apparently there's divisions in this church, probably at least four divisions, maybe two, which we'll talk about as we look at the next part of this chapter. And one of them is these women who are not wearing head coverings and who are speaking as if they were men, which is not uncommon, actually. I've experienced this in my life in the church, where the wife will stand. I remember one specific example. The wife stood up in a voters' assembly and spoke, we'll just say, in favor of something. I can't remember the exact condition. And then but she actually stood up and spoke in favor of something after her husband had stood up and spoken against it. And I just leaned over to whoever's sitting next to me and said, it's not going to be a fun drive home. Right? So husband and wife need to be one unit, especially husband and wife, that they act together. All right. And I've seen it flip the other way around too, where the husband neglects his duty. Well, that's actually kind of similar. Husband neglects his duty, and then his wife actually brings shame or dishonor upon her by her behavior, because she doesn't submit to him. All right. Or he doesn't do his job in guiding her and protecting her. So now we talk about these head coverings, and Paul in verse 10 calls them a symbol of authority on her head, that she is under the authority of her husband. But I think the argument can be made this is all women in the church. That's another story too. And just as the man leaves his head uncovered to show his submission to Christ, right? And then, of course, Christ is submissive to his Father. Not my will, but your will be done, he says. Okay. And then there's this little expression, which I think is fun to talk about, because of the angels. Because of the angels. Now, again, Paul's talking about the context of public worship here. And who is present in public worship? It's just a little throwaway phrase, but I think it's actually helpful. Is that the angels are present within corporate worship. Now, of course, we confess that. with saints and angels and the whole host of heaven, right? That's in the Sanctus. Oh, no, it's in the proper preface. Excuse me. In the proper preface. I was going to find something here. I have from an early church father. See where it is. I was going to share with you about the angels. Yes, orders of redemption, orders of creation, hair in the ancient world. Oh, I lost it. About the angels. Oh, well. All right. So, yeah. Um, I wonder where it went. It's in verse 10, right? Order of creation. Misplaced it. All right. So, now I'm going on, verse 13. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. All right. So remember, he's talking about traditions that have been handed over, and here he calls it a custom, here in verse 16. But he also says it's nature itself. And the Old Testament is rife with this when it comes to beards for men, right? That men don't, they might trim their beards, but they don't go barefaced. And there's a funny quote. I don't know if I'd be able to find it. Talking about how, who was this? It was somebody talking about how, as the woman's voice is made higher pitched, so the hair that is on her head is put on man's face, or something like that. First century guy, third century guy, I should say. Funny story. And this is still generally true, I'd say, today, is that men typically have shorter hair, although not necessarily. Our customs maybe have changed, but that women have long hair, and often women will intentionally cut their hair quite short, intentionally to do what Paul said above, which is to appear to be a man. I suppose this is especially the case among those with same-sex attraction, right? Who want to be the man, so to speak, of the relationship. And so, Paul is saying or suggesting, I think, by tradition and then also by culture or experience, to stick with it, to continue in the way that they already know. Now, if this were a universal prescription, I think he would have said, "Do you not know what the scriptures say, or has not God said?" Something like that. Or even, "I speak here now as an apostle, as one sent by God," something like that. But he's not. This is really Pauline opinion, I think, more than anything. But it's causing contention. It's causing division, right? So it's a really silly thing to get hung up on. So just keep at it. Wear the head coverings. Don't cut your hair. Men, cut your hair. Don't wear head coverings. Don't make any confusion here. Yeah, it looks like my computer has just decided to maintain very low bit rate. So who knows what my neighbors are doing on the internet tonight. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the Lord's Supper, and we'll see how far we can get. We want to just introduce this topic, but there's probably about maybe at least four major topics that we want to discuss in regards to this chapter. So I think we do well to spend some time. Now, in giving these instructions, so there's a helpful word, instructions. I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Right? So he just gave these instructions about head covering, not because they're doing well, but rather as a kind of an introductory foray into really a major issue. It's very similar to what he did with the food sacrifice to idols back, I think it was chapter 8. It was kind of a softball, rationale or point that he made. But then he goes really hard in the paint in chapter 10, saying just don't do it. for the sake of conscience, unless it can be done without sin. So something similar here. This head covering thing really wasn't the main thing. It's leading us into this, which is that there are divisions among you. First of all, I should read it first. So back to 17. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of the others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. Ooh, pretty harsh, Paul. All right. I think I can get most of it on the screen. All right, there we go. So they're not coming together for the better, for the worse. So maybe a little bit of an architecture conversation. These large gathering homes where they would have the church, and there's archaeology evidence of this in Corinth too, is that there would be like a central dining room, which could probably seat 12 or 13 around a large table. And then there would be like an outer courtyard where the servants and others could eat and drink. And it sounds as if, and there are examples of this in Roman writing from the time, that the noble or the wealthy would eat in that formal dining room, and then the commoners, or the less wealthy or the poor of the congregation even, would eat in the outer court, or in that larger space. Now, this reminds me growing up where the adults ate in one room and then all the children ate in another room. Similar to that. I'm looking to see if the video quality is going to come back. It does not. Oh, maybe it will now. All right. So they're doing something similar to that. So there's at least two major divisions. And I think back in Chloe mentioned, it was mentioned of Chloe back in chapter 1, that Chloe had reported to him these distinctions. So there's at least two divisions between those who are the wealthy or the patrons, and then those who are the commoners. It looks like the internet just went completely terrible. Now, God willing, you can still hear me. Yeah, hi. This is frustrating. But it's necessary to do it here. All right. I hear that there are divisions, and in part I believe it. I'm not surprised. In other words, for there must also be factions among you, but here's the reason: that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Yeah, those may be distinguished, or what's literally made manifest or evident. All right. So there are divisions, but the divisions are not between one group of faithful people and another group of faithful people, but it's actually the divisions that are made evident by God's word, and it's the distinction between those who are faithful and those who are not. So Paul's not surprised. There's no storms. Well, it's raining, but that's not going to affect this connection. No, as I said at the beginning, we share an internet connection wirelessly at a tower about 2 miles up the street. And so everybody between here and there all are on that one tower. And apparently everybody's using the internet tonight. All right. But it's a little bit of an experiment, so it goes. What were we saying? Oh, yes. There must be distinction. There must be factions. So there's always going to be a division in the church. Paul just said that in verse 19. There's always a division in the church. But the division isn't between one group of faithful people and another group of faithful people. The division is always between those who are faithful and those who are not. And maybe just in one matter, right? So one group wants to, try to think of a good example here, wants to celebrate the Lord's Supper as it's been given, and another group says that they want to celebrate it in a way that isn't given by Jesus. Now, that's actually a division, but that's not between two faithful groups of Christians. That's actually between one who listens to Jesus and one who doesn't. All right. So this is very important that we recognize that he's not surprised because there's always going to be that division. Think about like what we studied in this morning's and yesterday's congregation at prayer with the wheat and the tares, that the enemy sows tares among the wheat, right? And they grow up together, sons of the kingdom and sons of the devil. And they won't be separated until the last day, all right? Or sheep and goats would be another way to put it. So there's always going to be that division. All right. So therefore, verse 20, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Ouch. He's going to talk more about this Lord's Supper. They seem to have taken over the meal as something that they do for themselves. They have like a radical individual sense of this meal, right? Because look in verse 21, for in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. So maybe what was happening here is in the church, the wealthier the patrons would go first. They would eat the best of the food, and then what was left would be given to the rest of the people. And maybe some would not even receive any of what was left. It's mentioned in Jude and in some manuscripts of Second Peter, something called an agape fest or agape meal, a love meal, right? Which in theory means that everyone is receiving love by receiving food. But in practice, it turns out that actually some were given preferential treatment, those who are wealthy or important or of notoriety, and those who are poor or homeless or something like that would receive far less. And it seems like they're doing the same sort of thing here, where they're having a large meal, and then the culmination of that meal is the Lord's Supper. All right. And so then you end up with some who go hungry and another who engorge themselves, that have been drunk on wine. So this is something very important about the Lord's Supper, which we'll talk about next week, which is that everyone receives the same meal and the same benefit, regardless of their station or vocation in life, regardless of their wealth or lack thereof, regardless of even their importance to the congregation, that we all receive equally of the Lord, of his body and blood for our forgiveness, life, and salvation, right? And so there's no preferential treatment given to some and not to others. And to illustrate this, Paul says, well, why not just eat at home? You have houses to eat in. Why do you despise the church of God, the ecclesia? That's the gathering of the people of God. That's what that word church means. And shame those who have nothing by not giving them anything. What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. Yeah. Pretty harsh, right? So there's clearly some abuse happening here. And this is really a sober judgment from Paul, talking about this division that has happened in the way that they're celebrating the Lord's Supper and turning it into their own supper, if you like. So there's factions, there's self-centeredness. That's what sin is, by the way. It's being selfish. And so from the report from Chloe, as he talked about at the beginning of this section, it seems as if Paul has the impression that they've completely lost sight of what it means to have this ecclesia, this gathering, this church around which we receive the Lord's Supper. And so they've missed the point of the supper, no longer even celebrating it as the Lord's Supper. So their selfishness, their individualism is really destroying the character of what is given there. So that's why he says that expression, his own supper. And so then they're just making a joke of the whole thing. So, I mean, even while wealthy members might be separated from the poor members, the supper doesn't actually have any of those distinctions. Think about the way that Jesus, too, eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners. It causes great scandal. right? But he doesn't make any distinction about who he shares communal meal with, right? And that's not even the institution of the Lord's Supper. That's just eating and drinking, for the body. And this is very important in the ancient world, and I think we've probably missed this idea of um, that especially Luke has in mind in his gospel of table fellowship, right? Who you eat with um, is who you agree with, if you like. And it also is a demonstration of reconciliation, that you've been reconciled to one another, which of course we can talk about. All right, we've still got a few minutes with a terrible internet connection, so I might as well continue. I'm sorry I keep complaining about it, but this is very frustrating. It was much better earlier today. But live and learn. It's the evening. Well, we should read the words of institution here as given by Paul, and then we'll break these down more next week. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered or handed over to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." All right, pretty close to what you're used to hearing, which is a conflation of both Paul's recitation of the words here, and then also obviously that from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so that we get all the elements, especially the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. You see that's lacking here in verse 25. But I think Paul is recalling these words in a very specific way. There's a couple emphases that he makes that aren't in the Gospels. I don't know which ones we want to talk about yet tonight, but I think probably this expression in verse 24, "Do this in remembrance of me." Do this in remembrance of me. And you see that again in 25, "in remembrance of me." All right. So this is anamnesis in Greek, which is a kind of a technical term. This remembrance word is hearkening back, I think. Well, another way to translate this is kind of an archaic way to translate it. It would just simply be in my memory. So we're talking about the Passover, the Memorial Day, right? Which you shall celebrate as a feast of the Lord through all your generations. Remember Exodus 12. So it's remembering who Christ is and what he has done for you, right? And you see that especially in verse 26 when Paul says, he adds this addendum, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So the Lord's Supper, I'm trying to think, I can't remember who said this, that it is the layperson's preaching, something like that. It was in Latin, and I can't remember the Latin now either. But this is your preaching. By receiving Christ's body and blood, you are preaching that Christ Jesus died for sinners and that he gives you the fruit of that cross. He gives you what he purchased and won for you by his innocent suffering and death in the Lord's Supper: forgiveness of sins, life, and salvation. Right? So it is by doing it in his memory, or in the way that he gave it, you are proclaiming. You as a congregation, you as individuals, but especially as a congregation, are proclaiming the death and resurrection of Christ for sinners. This is the reason why the church, the Lutheran Church, on and off, but at least in its confession, has said that we celebrate the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day. That is every Sunday, which is what we consider the Lord's Day. That we always proclaim the resurrection, death and resurrection of Christ on Sunday by receiving his body and his blood under the bread and the wine. All right, so this is one of the reasons for that, because it is our part of our proclamation, the proclamation that Christ has given us to do. All right, so I think that remembrance word is it is unique here to Paul, his emphasis upon that. But in the context of the church in Corinth, he wants to reiterate that for their sake because they've lost sight of it. All right, they've missed the boat, so to speak. Oh, I see something I can do to actually make it a little bit better. Audio yet again. Look at that. Yeah, like that. Wow, it's probably a little bit louder now for you, coming out of both sides too. So the church in Corinth has lost sight of how it is the Lord's Supper. It's given by him for them, not them for their offering of a meal for him. And also it is their proclamation, and that if they eat and drink of this in a way that is unworthy, which we'll talk about next week, then it actually is a false proclamation that they are preaching or teaching outside of what Christ has given. All right. So just that's a little bit of a introduction to that memory text, but maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the words of institution, then we'll talk about unworthy reception. We don't really probably need to be too exhaustive on the words, but they are central to Paul's argument moving forward. All right, so we're at 58 minutes. I think that's good. And again, apologies for the video. It's completely terrible right now, and it should be fine. So, as I mentioned this morning, we pay $130 a month for this connection, and this is the best that it can do. So I'm not real satisfied with that, and I think we can do better. It's just a matter of getting the right players involved and getting it done. So Lord be with you all. Keep you safe this evening, and we'll see you in the morning for our congregation at prayer.